Good morning, everyone. This is Chris Endres of the Konrad Adenauer Foundation. We are live. Rebecca, I hand the word to you.
Thank you, Chris. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to this second session of the Midpoint Paper Series. My name is Rebecca Sibanda. I am a constitutional law researcher, and I will be your moderator today. This conversation is very important because the state of the electorate in South Africa is a critical and always topical issue, especially if we consider that we just came off the back of by-elections that had poor turnout, partly because of the pandemic, but also because of a trend we have begun to see in young voters not participating in universal suffrage. Before I go too far, I'm going to introduce our panelists. First of all, you've already heard, we have Mr. Christian Endres, who is the project manager at CAS here in South Africa. We also have Dr. Collette Schulz-Herzenberg, who is here in her capacity as an expert on South African voting behavior, and her paper is actually what this discussion is based on. We're going to be sharing this paper with everybody who has participated here today. We also have Ms. Shaylin Clark, who is the communications officer at My Vote Counts, a lobby group that has been pushing for electoral change in South Africa for years. Last and definitely not least, we have Mr. John Steenhuisen, who is the leader of the Democratic Alliance, which is the official opposition party in South Africa. I'm going to hand over to Chris, who is going to quickly just introduce the midpoint and tell us what it's about, as well as our question. But before I do, please can I just remind everyone to keep their mics muted unless they are participating or speaking. If you have any questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat bar on the side. And when we get to our Q&A session, we'll try to address some of them. Thank you. Over to you, Chris.
Right. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. We're delighted to have so many people dropping into the call and also to have our fantastic speakers today. A good mix of academia, of active politics, and of civil society. A quick word on the Konrad Adenauer Foundation. We are a German political foundation that operates in over 120 countries, and our aim is to promote democracy. The Midpoint is part of a new project that we've started in South Africa, which is a platform in which opposition politicians and parties can show their substantive ability to engage with long-term megatrends in South African politics. There are three parts to this project. The first is a webinar which launches the topic, together with an in-depth study by an expert. These materials are placed onto a web page which can be accessed at any point later on, which will be updated with materials, analysis, media, and more videos to explore the topic. And it will really be a go-to place when it comes to whatever the topic is. Today's topic is the non-voter phenomenon in South Africa, an urgent threat to South African democracy. And the next webinar, the Midpoint webinar, is going to be under the title of Brittle Democracies, looking at the long-term trends of liberation parties in former British colonies in Africa. So we're looking forward to a very exciting series of webinars next year. And I invite you all to join as often as you can, because we look forward to having as much engagement as possible on the webpage. Thank you very much, Rebecca. I hand back to you.
Thank you so much, Chris. So we're going to start by watching a video that Colette recorded earlier that's going to kind of expound on the non-voter phenomenon and why numbers matter, particularly for the under 40 demographic of voters in South Africa today.
The purpose of the paper is to understand not as who is turning out to elections and voting, but who is not. In other words, what we really wanted to establish in this piece of research was understanding the demographic profile and attitudinal profiles of non-voters in South Africa. So why do research on non-voters in the first instance? In 2019, as we went to the polls in our general election, we saw a decrease, a sudden decrease in voter turnout and electoral participation. And this really accelerated an already steady decline in electoral participation since 1994. But the question is, so what? Does it matter if people begin to turn away from the polls? Well, low voter turnout globally is associated with negative indicators for the health of a democracy. It's seen perhaps as a sign of voter apathy, It's also seen as a sign of growing mistrust in the political system itself. It also throws question marks over the sanctioning and representative functions of a democracy. If people decline to turn out and participate, their views, thoughts, and preferences are not recorded in an election outcome, and this undermines representation. And then the overall quality of democracy, its entire legitimacy, can stand to be scrutinized. Of all eligible South Africans who are allowed to vote, 75% were registered. 66% of all registered citizens actually turned out to vote on the day. But if we take a step back and we look at the broader picture, and we look at a far more accurate measure of voter turnout by looking at eligible voters, what we call the voting age population, all South Africans 18 years old and older who are eligible to cast a vote in South Africa, we find that in fact only 49% of all eligible South Africans cast a vote in 2019. This means that more South Africans did not vote. Although declining turnout in itself is a concern, the way it is unfolding in South Africa is of deep concern. And this is because it is being primarily driven by the withdrawal of young people from active voting. And this dramatic decrease in this particular age group is worrisome because South Africa has a young population, what we call a youth bulge. Now, although young people declining to participate is actually a global phenomenon, we see it in other democracies around the world, it's having a lesser impact on aggregate turnout because young people in older democracies make up a smaller proportion of the population. In South Africa, we make up a greater proportion of the population. So, in a sense, the inactivity of young people at elections will come to shape our future elections. And this is because voting is a learned habit. So what's actually happening is that the habit of not voting is being learned by young people in South Africa. And as they move up the age cohort, so this habit of non-voting is seeping into our electorate. Of course, non-voting has a lot to do with registration. So much of the research looks at who is registering and who is not registering. Of the under 40-year-olds who are eligible, only 46% are registered to vote. If we zoom in and look at the under 20s, so that'll be our 18, 19 and 20-year-olds, of all of those eligible to vote, only 19% are registered to do so, and fewer actually cast a vote. If we look at the under 30s, between 20 and 30-year-old, 54% are registered to vote. In other words, just over half can participate on the day. Political parties and independent candidates who wake up to the notion that we have a formidable force of young people who are up for grabs, potentially, and who push policy platforms and positions that resonate with this younger group of voters, they hold the key to future electoral swings in the country.
Sorry for the cutoff there. We're going to just ask a few questions of John and Shaylin based on what we have heard. Shaylin and John, in your experience, your respective experience, what has been your understanding or your relationship with the under 40 demographic that seems not to want to vote? Do they have a specific political culture, and what's your relationship with it? Shaylin?
Okay, so in the experience that civil society, including my sees, is that people in this age group, they feel as if their immediate needs are not being met. Immediate needs like jobs, education, healthcare, safety. These are things that will enable them to not just live better lives, but be self-sufficient, take care of themselves, take care of their families. These are things they need now. And what they are experiencing is that what they are seeing from especially parties who are in power, that they do not feel as if these parties really do have great concern and have practical ways in which to deliver on these
Great. We appear to have lost Rebecca, unfortunately, to a bad connection, but I'll hand over to John. Perhaps you want to respond to Shailen's statement around young people not feeling that their core needs of unemployment and education are being met, and that they don't feel that parties are addressing these concerns.
Thanks very much. Yeah, look, I think that there's a lot of truth in that. I think that we've seen a lot of young South Africans opting out of politics as they don't see it as a means of resolving the issues that matter to them going forward. They see a bunch of people squabbling over a variety of things that really are beyond what they believe are important issues. And they opt out of the system. And obviously this is very dangerous for a number of reasons. First of all, people opt out of the political system and want to find expression for their views and opinions that often can manifest itself in radicalism external to the political system. And I think you've really started to see some of this happening in South Africa. People then go outside of the bounds of the democratic infrastructure, and we've seen schools being burnt down, infrastructure being burnt down, people finding other ways to express themselves or to be heard outside of the political arena. And I think that should concern all of us. I think that if one looks at the last election, the ANC essentially got elected with a 26% mandate from the people of South Africa. That's very, very low mandate. And the biggest opters out at that time were young people. And I think we've got to do far more to show young South Africans particularly that these platforms are relevant, and that if you do want to change your life, that voting, getting involved in politics, using the democratic process, making your members of parliament work for you and raise the issues that matter to you, are important. But I also think there's a systemic design problem that is preventing that from taking place. And I think it revolves around the way in which our political system is structured, where there is a deep disconnect between the electors and the elected. And I think that gap and gulf is felt far harder by young people than by middle-aged older people.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Shailen. Can either of you maybe tell us if you have ever considered introducing the idea of compulsory registration upon the attainment of the age of majority? We have a number of jurisdictions that require young people, once they turn 18, to register to vote. And do you think that would in any way, shape or form change the voter turnout, particularly among young people? There are some jurisdictions that also require people to vote, and if they don't, there's criminal sanction for that. Is that something the DA would ever consider tabling? Shailen, do you think that would be effective? And maybe Collette, you can weigh in as well after the two have spoken.
Okay. From my understanding, I mean, this could be a viable option to ensure that we could see more voters, because I mean, you can register, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you actually go out to vote. Maybe some more thinking around this needs to be done, maybe in terms of who will actually drive this. Is this the IEC? I mean, they do have a mandate to ensure that people are registered and go out to the polls. So will this be the IEC driving this? Will this be civil society driving this? And also we need to also just make sure that the messaging behind this steers clear from any sort of bias, perhaps. So maybe more thinking around this, but it could be a viable option. But again, registering, making sure that people register doesn't necessarily mean they'll actually go out.
Okay, while John rejoins us, Collette, do you mind maybe weighing in on whether forced registration is effective in changing how voters show up to the polls?
Yeah, thanks very much for the opportunity. I'm an advocate of automatic registration, where the state takes an active role in getting people on the voters' roll. And that for me is an administrative process. It's about merging Home Affairs with the voters' roll at the IEC. I don't envisage it being necessarily particularly problematic. I think there must be a distinction made between automatic registration, where the onus is taken away from voters to the state for registration, and then compulsory voting, which is actually an infringement on our right to choose to vote in the Constitution. So what I'm really suggesting in this paper is that we take some of the laborious effort that has to be put into perhaps traveling long distances to registration stations, away from people who perhaps live in rural areas, those of us who are economically less able, those of us that work or with childcare responsibilities. If we can just get everybody onto the voters' roll, I think there is one obstacle out of the way on election day. Of course, that information would need to be verified, but it needs to be verified anyway with the IEC, with addresses and so forth. So that would be my suggestion in terms of automatic registration, just to really open up the system to allow young people to know that they actually are registered voters.
Go for it.
If I can jump in for a moment, a question to the panelists. Do you think that any political parties gain by having low registrations and low voter turnout? Is that in the interests of any political parties?
Go ahead, John.
Yeah, well, thanks. I certainly think it would be in the interests, particularly of a governing party that has performed badly. Now, we did research after the last 2019 elections. Our research department went out and looked specifically at polling people who didn't vote and to find out what the reasons were. The top three reasons: I didn't have my ID or temporary ID. So I think there's a huge systemic problem as well with access to the documentation that's required. It's very cumbersome to be able to get an ID. There's been a complete breakdown at Home Affairs. It becomes a day off work to just go and make an application for the documentation. Secondly, the second highest was there's no point in voting because my vote won't change anything. So I definitely think that for a non-performing incumbent governing party, I think there's a huge incentive that people don't register to vote, because if they adopt a laissez-faire approach and are not going to get involved in changing the system, I think that suits a non-performing incumbent governing party.
Collette?
I think this is perhaps a point that needs to come up and will come up again and again, is that, touching on what John has just said and others, that there's something we call political efficacy, and increasingly there's the logistics of voting, registration and so forth. But there's an attitudinal component which is starting to emerge in the data, which is becoming increasingly worrisome, which is that voters are starting to understand that they can't make a difference to the political outcome, whether they vote or not. In other words, their vote doesn't count. But that's internal efficacy. That's my understanding of how my ability to change the system, my internal competence. But what's emerged in the 2019 data and overtaken internal efficacy is external efficacy, where people are increasingly perceiving that the system is not responsive. And I think we can have a huge discussion about why that is. But essentially, people are looking at the political system broadly, and they're understanding it as less responsive than it used to be. And that's been a massive deterrent to turnout.
Thank you for all your contributions. I think it's been interesting so far to understand that non-voting people actually benefit someone, and what the variables are that contribute to young people not voting. So we're going to move to the second video, again, a pre-recorded video from Collette. And this video is going to address why people vote or why they don't vote.
Voters who are exposed to a greater variety of campaigns on the ground, in other words, they have a larger menu of political options in the urban provinces, are more likely to find a political home, be mobilized to vote through campaigning, and actually turn out at elections. This is in contrast to the rural provinces, where rural voters have begun to withdraw from voting in far greater proportions to urban voters. And we put this down to the possibility that these voters have less exposure to campaigns on the ground. And this is largely because opposition parties, the smaller parties, haven't got the resources and the ability to penetrate the rural provinces to the extent that they can in the bigger urban centres. And this leaves rural voters with a smaller choice from which to choose. And if they have become disillusioned with the ANC, they begin to withdraw their support, but they do not shift their support, and they become abstainers. Now, if we look at partisanship, party loyalties, we know that people with a strong party loyalty are more easily mobilized and tend to turn out to vote compared to non-partisans who are far harder to mobilize. And this decline in partisanship that we see in South Africa was quite pronounced in 2019. In other words, more South Africans than ever state that they do not feel close to a particular political party. And so they lack this psychological anchor in the political world that guides them on their voting choice and to participate at elections. So what this basically means is that this reliance using a traditional party queue is disappearing from the South African electorate. And it means that South African political parties and actors are going to have to work far harder to mobilize this growing group of voters to come to the polls. People tend to vote if they are encouraged to do so by the relationships that they have, their social networks, and the membership that they hold. So they are receiving political communication from their social networks, which encourage them and create a social desirability to turn out to vote. We know, for example, that somebody is far more likely to vote if their partner or spouse voted. They are far more likely to vote if they belong to a membership of a trade union or church or political party membership. And it's this sort of network that should be utilized in South Africa to encourage people to the polls. And I'm not suggesting that those networks push a partisan message, but one more of civic-mindedness, that voting is civic, it's a civic duty, it's a responsibility, and that it's an opportunity to actually formulate policy and change governments. But unfortunately, we also know that young people are less likely to be part of social and organizational networks. And this is one of the reasons why young people are traditionally quite difficult to mobilize to vote. They lack these social networks until later adulthood. We also know from the data that we ran for this paper that, in fact, if somebody feels discontented with government's overall performance, they are more likely to vote. Now, this was a very interesting finding because it suggests that, in fact, people look at elections as a sanctioning mechanism. They are using elections to reward or punish governments, incumbents, as they see fit. And this presents another strategy, another tactic for electoral players. We should be utilizing the discussions around government's performance and political party performance to mobilize people to come to the polls. If people are discontented, they need to understand that elections are there to lodge that dissatisfaction. But having said that, that's one part of the strategy. The other part of the strategy is to couple that with positive, progressive policy platforms and leadership quality, because that is the other half of the equation that is missing for voters. We can have discussions about whether we are content or discontented with government's performance and how that could be improved. But without presenting credible political alternatives, voters are still left bereft. They do not have
I think we have a connectivity problem, or the video has been cut off again. Can everybody hear me? Okay, so I think the bulk of what the video is saying is that we need to find innovative and new ways to engage this particular demographic and convince them that their vote matters and that they should go to the polls come voting day. Shaylin, John, Collette, how do voters learn about political parties and what they stand for and their manifestos? Is this information easily accessible? Is it inclusive? Are the mediums used to, in your experience, effective in garnering, or attracting young voters to the poll on voting day? Shayla, I see your hand up.
Yeah. So this is a very interesting question, a very interesting topic, and this comes to civic education, and that there is there's a huge lack in civic education in our country or many countries around the world. Young people in particular need to know the implications of voting and not voting, especially next year's elections, local government elections. That's traditionally an elections where fewer people go out to vote than national elections. So just the implications of voting and not voting, how this affects you, but even just information on party manifestos. Like for those of us right now on this webinar, it's really easy for us via social media. In this country, as we know, that digital gap is very, very wide. There's so many people who have no access to the internet, Facebook, Twitter, that will have access to these manifestos. And also these things are very long, big documents. No one wants to really read these things. The language is pretty heavy. Things like policies, bills. I mean, I interact with Parliament a lot, so I read bills and things like that. Not many people do that because it's not really interesting, even though it's important. It's not really interesting. So all the language and the way things are packaged is not packaged in a way that's digestible, that makes you want to engage in it. It's too above, many people's understanding, even though they need to engage in these things. So there's a need there to really focus on the way we package information, how we access the information. Is it just solely on the internet? Because many people don't have access to the internet. Do we use our libraries, constituency offices, which is around the country? Many of these offices are empty, and that's just a fact. We need to really make sure that we look at these things and it needs to start there.
Thank you so much, Shannon. You've hit on a very important point that a lot of people don't have access to or understand the language in which manifestos are written. So it's difficult to communicate your message to a large contingent of South Africans. John?
Yeah, thanks. Just two things. I mean, first of all, I was very interested to hear what Collette had to say around the voters punishing governments where they haven't performed, because that hasn't been our experience. And you look at those municipalities that are dissolved due to complete service delivery failure. You look at those municipalities where they are dissolved because of massive service delivery protests, and almost every single one of them, after the election, it's the same parties and the same individuals are returned to office. So I don't think there is a maturity yet in the South African political space where voters understand the way they vote affects the way they live. And that's why you see councillors, parties that have destroyed small towns, but they keep being re-elected back into them, even when there is an intervention to dissolve it. And there's very little movement. Then, maybe it's got to do with the alternative that Collette was talking about. In terms of younger people, we obviously younger people have got a far higher access to data and to the means of being able to get onto the internet through mobile phones, etc. Many of the urban centres, there are areas where you are able to access free Wi-Fi, public libraries, etc. So we're piloting a whole new direct communication model to communicate directly with voters around the country using our own platforms. Young people don't read newspapers. It's a fact. I think that's why there's a declining readership in newspapers around the country. That's not how they access information. They access information on various other social media platforms and the like. And I think parties have got to remain alive to that. So we've just spent a significant amount of money constructing a studio with our own external broadcast facilities so that we can speak on YouTube, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, etc. Be able to go and put messages out there for young voters where they are. They don't come to public meetings. I mean, one of my favorite complaints at every public meeting I attend is, well, where are the young people? And I just said, you have to say to people, young people do not come to town hall meetings. It's just not how they choose to access information. And you've got to change your model if you're wanting to be able to get messaging in front of them. So I'm really excited about the potential for the direct communication model. We piloted it rather well, I think, during the coronavirus pandemic with the Corona Cast, knowing people were going to be at home, broadcasting weekly a information show, giving people information around the coronavirus, having various guests on, and the levels of engagement, particularly from younger people, was massive compared to anything else that we've done. I think it's also then important to make sure that manifestos are digestible. And so we, particularly using social media, are relying a lot more on infographics that explain a very big concept around something, but reducing it to just one small picture where you can look at it and see and get the point of what that manifesto point is actually saying. So I think that we've got to simplify the message. The days of people trawling through 15 to 30 pages of manifesto or policy, it's not going to happen. You need to be able to break it up, I believe, into a far more digestible format, and one in which is easy to access for people on the platforms where they spend most of their time.
Thank you, John. I think once again, it's important for us to remember the striation in South Africa. A lot of young people in urban areas have access to data and information, but there's a large contingent that doesn't. So even if you use technology and social media, you're still excluding quite a number of people in that demographic because either they don't understand the information, they don't have access to it, or they don't know it exists. So I think it goes back to what Shaylin said, that civic education needs to start much younger, broadly applied. Collette, you had your hand raised?
Yeah, maybe just to add to those thoughts, I would agree with that the school curriculum should probably start engaging these debates and quite meaningfully, actually. So by the time people reach 18, we have a very clear understanding of what the role of an election is all about. And, perhaps just to respond very briefly to John's point, it does seem that, particularly in municipalities where incumbents have done rather a poor job of governance, they are returned to power. But remember that this is coming off the back of smaller and shrinking sections of the electorate in that particular area. So I think what we're trying to say is that actually they are being punished. There is a sanctioning function happening. If you look at the data, it's very clear amongst all South Africans, Black South Africans, ANC partisans, if there is disgruntlement with the incumbents, they tend to withdraw their support. But the problem we have is a structural one in the party landscape, in the sense that South Africans struggle to make the journey from one party to another. And why is that? One would have imagined 25 years after elections that, and with de-alignment as well, in other words, we are less close to political parties than we used to be, that we would see a lot of inter-party movement. Now, we are finding inter-party movement, but it's still quite marginal. It's minuscule, actually, in some cases. What we are seeing instead are people moving into abstention. So the question for me is, why is this happening? And here we have to have a difficult conversation. People are looking at performance and they're disgruntled, so they're moving away. So that's the one issue. The other is policy, and the other are party and candidate attributes. And I think we could have a really big discussion about those things. I think in terms of what opposition parties are putting forward, sometimes, although there are clear policies, and I'm not denying the DA has a clear policy trajectory, those policy, the messaging, the way it's communicated to this particularly younger electorate can be quite convoluted at times. And I wonder if we don't need to be far more creative as opposition parties across the board in terms of how we send out messages using these newer social media platforms, grasping the imagination in an Obama-esque way, if you like, to be able to have one sort of singular message, bearing in mind that young people are not homogenous. They reflect the social landscape of South Africa, but there is something unique about their generation. And I think that gets lost at elections. And I put that down also to there's a disconnect between what the media serves out in the way of messaging and what political parties are trying to do. So I think the media and its messaging of party policy discussions is missing. We tend to overly focus on the attributes of candidates, the racial credentials of political parties and who they may or may not represent. And the policy alternatives are getting lost, particularly for younger people.
I see we've lost Rebecca again, so I'm going to jump in on the moderation part. Thank you very much, Collette. That's very helpful. Perhaps something to touch on is, do we really have grassroots political parties in South Africa, or do we just have campaign machines that kick in before elections and disappear in between? Because a lot of the things that you were saying in the previous video about organizational networks and relationships suggests that actually people don't don't interact with political parties on a regular basis. They only hear from them occasionally. Is that something that, Sheila, maybe you've seen in grassroots conversations, that people reflect that?
This then also comes back to access. So there's still this thing where people in communities don't even know where their ward council is, or don't know where to find them. Like I said earlier, there are constituency offices that are still pretty empty. And these are people that people in communities on the ground. This should be your first point of access. You know, these ward councillors, constituency officers. So that's number one. And there's so many political parties out there that are registered, and I do believe that there are parties that are, you know, all for grassroots communities, but they don't get the airtime that the bigger political parties do get. So they perhaps don't have the ability to get their message out like the NCDA, the EFF, IFP can, because there are bigger parties that get bigger airtime, bigger media coverage. So it's, for me, it's like those 2 points: the accessibility of like ward councillors in communities, constituency offices, and also just the airtime that smaller parties that maybe could be more focused on like people in grassroots level. They perhaps don't have as much media coverage or communication as.
Thank you so much. I'm sorry I logged out because of my network. John, what do you think? Do you think that political parties are actively engaging with their constituencies consistently between elections, or is it that just before they want to engage during campaign periods? I'm not sure if John heard me there.
I suggest let's switch to the video, and perhaps in the meantime, John will come back.
Okay. Just before we finish the session, Collette, do you have anything to add to that perhaps political parties are campaign machines as opposed to vehicles to engage with communities and their constituencies throughout their terms?
Thanks, Rebecca. Look, I have no doubt that there are plenty of people working across constituency offices in this country for all political parties and really putting their utmost into this between elections. But the appearance, I think, for the broader electorate is that 9 months before a large election approaches, a general election, you know, political parties start up their election machinery. We get a great deal of coverage of politicians walking around local communities. And so there is a sense that, again, there's a massive disconnect between elections. And we know that that actually shouldn't be the case. There should be an ongoing two-way flow, information flow between the electorate and their representative bodies, political parties. But it certainly doesn't seem to be working like that on the ground. And I would agree. I think we need far more grassroots connectivity in this country between political parties and communities. But I do appreciate the fact that opposition parties in particular have quite a major structural barrier, which is called party funding. It's not easy to penetrate a large country like South Africa with diverse communities and set up and be sort of instantaneously available. So I think those things need to grow organically, but that takes time. The ANC, of course, came to power with that grassroots mobilization at its fingertips, and it's been able to utilize it very well at every election. Obviously, it's become trickier in the last few elections for the party to be able to just switch on traditional constituencies, and that's where some of the interesting politics of this country will be going in the next few years. But I think there is a challenge on the ground outside of urban areas in particular for opposition parties to really meaningfully engage because there are financial and other constraints.
Yes, so I've just come back from 2 days on the ground in rural parts of Oxford. Again, I mean, it's huge ground travel and huge financial challenge as well. people opposition party. And
John, I'm going to have to cut you off there. The connection is really bad and we can't really hear you. So I think maybe if we can get your comments in the chat and we'll move on to the next video. So the next video again from Collette is one where we're going to discuss non-partisanship and the key aspects of non-voting in the youth. And we have to recognize or acknowledge the fact that there's something missing and how do we address that. So let's watch the video.
Voters who are exposed to a greater variety of campaigns. Voters who are exposed to a greater variety of campaigns on the ground.
We're having a lot of fun, Rebecca. Unfortunately, the video is also not playing. So I think let's carry on in the discussion.
Okay, so if Collette doesn't mind giving us a little rundown of how she understands how non-partisanship is a big element of why young people are not joining parties or not finding political homes and therefore converting that relationship with politics to going to vote on voting day.
Sure, thanks, Rebecca. Look, I mean, partisanship is socialized. We grow up in families that have a leaning to a political party or a political candidate. In the US, you're born into a Democratic or Republican household. You might have some debate within the household, but you essentially wear that as a label, a little bit like you feel close to a political, a football, club or so on. And so it's it's a very deep entrenched identity. And what's been quite interesting in South Africa is that this particular generation seem not to have undergone that socialization process. Most young people say that they actually don't feel close to a particular political party. So we seem to be shaking off our partisan inclinations in this newest generation in South Africa, sort of born frees and post-born frees. And this is really interesting and exciting because what it does mean is that there are this huge group of potential voters out there who are not born to one or another particular political party. And what we can expect is much greater fluidity at elections, right? So young people will be going to the polls, looking at other issues, perhaps the performance of governments and other political parties. Perhaps they are cued by a particular candidate that they really like or dislike, but it'll be what we call short-term events and short-term issues. And this would create a great deal of fluidity in the electoral system. In other words, it should be more nail-biting. We shouldn't really know who's going to win the election. Partisanship creates stable but predictable elections. And that's been no bad thing in South Africa for the last 20 years. We needed stability and we needed some predictability to get through democratization. But now we need to hold our incumbents and all our political players accountable. And the only thing that breeds accountability is unpredictability, not knowing whether you're going to win the next election or not and having to perform so much better than the next contender. So we should expect to see more fluidity coming from young people. I think it will come. We just need to get them to the polls. The older generations, the older age groups are far more likely to be partisan. In other words, their voters more predictable. But again, what was alarming in the 2019 data is that even partisans were less likely to vote in this last general election than ever before. So I would attribute that to the fact that there was something about the party system right now, the political system, which is turning voters off generally, whether they're partisan or non-partisan.
That is very interesting. And I think before I ask Chris to handle the Q&A session from all the questions in the chat, I'm going to just ask two questions of you and Shaylin. Unfortunately, John has not been able to reconnect. It would have been interesting to hear his view as well. What is your opinion on looking or at how young people are expressing their political discontent outside of the voting system? Do you think it's effective, and do you think that we're trying to, or we're beginning to create a landscape where looking forward, we might have a different way of electing our representatives. We might have a different way of expressing or experiencing democracy because young people aren't going to the polls and because for some reason political parties are failing to bridge that gap. And the second question is for Shaylin specifically. We saw how the electorate landscape changed with the arrival of the EFF a few years ago, and just how a lot of people changed their political homes. Is that an indication of discontent with the parties that exist? Is that an indication of the thirst for something new and something different? And what's your opinion with the way that the relationship with the EFF has changed over the years, from this incredible thirst for something new, and then now how people who were initially maybe enamored with the EFF are not so much today? Collette, you can go first.
Okay, sure, thanks. So there's a lot of questions. I'm really doubtful that I'll even cover many of them. But yeah, the EFF did represent something new. It's quite interesting, however, if you look at public opinion survey post-election results, we actually found quite a lot of movement between the EFF and other political parties. So I think the EFF would be dismayed to find out that it lost almost half of its 2014 support to either the abstention category or another political party in 2019. Having said that, it attracted quite a lot of new support. So this is a very fluid party at the inner core. These aren't people who are staying from one election to the other, although we only have 2 election data points to look at. There were people who were disgruntled with the first 4 years of the EFF's presence in political life, and they moved away. But the party still managed to attract more voters. What does this tell us? It means that the South African electorate has potential to be very fluid, and the EFF was able to provide something that attracted people away from other parties or away from abstention to this political party, and that matters a great deal. It shows us that we're not beholden in a very traditional way to our political parties. To answer your first question, yes, I don't want to create the impression that young people are apathetic, politically apathetic. I don't think that is the case at all. I think what's happening here is there's a disconnect between formal political party politics, conventional politics, the way young people understand political parties as vehicles for representation. And either political parties need to transform and reform, or young people will find other means to basically affect change in their countries. And we see this happening every day. If we want to draw young people back into sort of formal institutionalized politics, my suggestion would be for political parties to start reimagining themselves quite significantly. But young people are political and they will make that felt.
Sorry, Rebecca, I've switched off John's video. John, I'll switch off your video to see if that helps the stability of your connection, but feel free to speak. I see you've got your hand up.
Can we just jump to Shaylin and then ask John to answer the question after, and then we can go to the Q&A time.
Okay. So for young people, yes, they are moving away from being partisan or donning a particular set of colors, because for young people, it's more how does the political representative or party, do they relate to me in terms of gender representation and policies around like gender equality, gender-based violence, all those things? Do they represent me in terms of, where I am in my financial economic situation? So it's more, how does a political representative represent me, or do we align in a policy way? Less of, do you wear yellow, do you wear pink, blue, less of that. And I think this is how or why when the EFF started, it was, wow, the EFF's a new party. People flock from other political parties, young people, they had a really good base with young people, especially young celebrities. They represented the young people coming in with their overalls, representing young people, domestic workers, and all this group of people that otherwise would have been excluded. And we are obviously seeing now people are less inclined to support the EFF for various reasons, perhaps. Maybe seeing that they're perhaps not exactly what they said that they were in the beginning, when it was all there's this protest here, they're being called out, being shoved out of parliament here and there. So it's for young people, especially, as more, will you really represent me once you come in power, or will you just be, like we spoke earlier, just a marketing machine, just there to get more funding? How do you represent me once you are?
Okay, John, I hope you can hear us. We were speaking about how political parties can be innovative to address the non-partisanship of young people. So I was wondering if you could give us, for example, an elevator pitch of your economic policy that you would pitch to young people to convince them to vote for the DA in the upcoming elections.
You can stay as you are for the rest of your life, or you can change to the DA, and that's just simply it. It comes down to that. If you want change, you've got to vote for it, and that's the bottom line. We keep doing what we've always done, you're going to always get what you've always got. You've got to change. I do want to make one other point, though, that I think that, and I'm sorry, my internet connection is appalling, and it's obviously caused a bit of problems here, and I'm not sure if the point was made. But I think it's got to go beyond representing and making sure that you involve young people in your structures and get them into parliament and into councils. That you've got to make sure that when young people look at the party, they see their... If one looks at the position benches in Parliament, the much higher percentage of young people. I mean, my shadow cabinet now has got some of the really exciting young people that have been appointed into key portfolios that affect young people, things like basic education and the like. And, you know, there you've got young MPs that are out there in the arena. And I think that what the message that sends to other young people is that, well, you know, maybe there is a spot for me in the arena. Maybe if I want to affect change, maybe I need to get involved, and maybe I need to get there. So I think that this notion that you've got to earn a gold watch, you know, 25 years service before you come to Parliament is a terrible thing to do. And the more young people we can get in the benches of Parliament, I think the more exciting young people are going to be about, well, here's some people speaking up for me. And I looked at the speech that someone like Shlomo Bukwa did in Parliament 2 years ago. It really set the world alight. And, you know, there's young people out there articulating, and many more on the opposition benches, but a few on the governing benches as well. But we've got to get more young people involved in politics, and parties have to make the path to getting into Parliament far easier for young people, rather than expect them to just hang around for years, you know, in a branch doing activism. We've got to get them into Parliament and to councils where they can start articulating the voices of their generation.
Thank you so much, John. I'm going to now hand over to Chris, who's going to do our Q&A session. We are running out of time, so please make sure that, you know, your questions are in the chat and we'll try and address them. Over to you, Chris.
Yeah, so thank you, Rebecca. I just wanted to, so we're running quite tight, so I'm just going to pick one question. But we do have the contact details of people who signed up for this webinar. So what I suggest is that we engage with you on your questions after the webinar, because they are very worthwhile questions. But John and Collette, I think specifically for you, there is this ongoing rumor in South Africa that people, and I'm not sure if it's substantiated in fact, that people are bussed into municipalities to vote and swing the election results, especially at local level, and that undermines accountability at the local level, and that as a consequence then feeds up into the belief that there's no accountability at the national level. Do we have any evidence of the busing of voters into other municipalities, and do you think that would undermine accountability? Collette, would you maybe start us?
Sure. Look, I don't personally have evidence of that. I mean, I think that's a question for the IEC, because they really need to be, you know, fully funded and supported to be on top of that sort of thing. I mean, my understanding is that people are registered at particular voting stations, and it's very difficult to vote outside of your voting stations. So, I mean, I'd be curious to know more about this. Of course, we've heard anecdotally that this does happen, and it's swell numbers, you know, across provincial and other district borders, etc. But I would just be very interested in the logistics of all of this and how that's actually happening. You know, what is the IEC saying about this? Because this is a really serious sort of gerrymandering situation. And if it is happening, it needs to be stamped out immediately. You know, I've always been impressed with the IEC's integrity and their ability to run a tight and free and fair election. So, I mean, this is the sort of thing that the IEC need to be held to account, probably through Parliament, actually. I'd be very interested in John's opinion on this.
So we've come across a number of problems with the IEC, but generally, you know, by and large, I've found them to be very efficient and effective at doing what they needed to do. We've only come across a few cases where there's obviously been busing, and the most notable one, I think, was in Tlokwe, where there was significant busing in to affect the outcome of that local municipal election. But here's the thing, it's all going to come down to funding. And if anyone speaks to the IEC, and certainly when they appear before parliaments and others, they've got a cash crunch. And their efficacy and their ability to be able to guarantee free and fair elections comes down to their ability to be able to fund those operations. And I think it's a very dangerous thing to do, to underfund your electoral commission, because that's when you get corners being cut. It's when the checks and balances start to weaken. And I think you end up with greater problems in the system. I don't think we're at a stage of crisis yet with the IEC, but certainly if one listens to the warnings that are being sounded by elections, one of the things they're talking about next year, for instance, not enough funding to have 2 registration weekends, only to have 1 registration weekend ahead of the local government elections. Massively disenfranchising of citizens if you only get 1 registration weekend because of financial constraints to the IEC. So I think if we want to have a culture of free and fair elections, then I'm afraid it means you've got to put your money where your mouth is and ensure that the IEC is properly funded so that it can continue the high standards of oversight, accountability, and ensuring free and fair elections going forward. Once that starts to fray, I think it has the potential to undermine the whole system, and I think it would then make voter participation even worse, because then people are not only being apathetic or cross because of lack of service delivery, people no longer believe it's a legitimate outcome. And there's no point to me voting because it's going to get rigged anyway. And therefore, I'm not wasting my time. So I think that this is going to be a big issue for us in the coming year. We're already putting significant pressure on the IEC to ensure there is a second registration weekend at the very least, and that there needs to be far more targeted registration around the country, at schools, at other facilities. And but all this comes down, of course, to financial constraints. We need to make sure we've got a properly funded IEC.
Thank you so much, John. Thank you very much to everybody that's participated. Please may I ask you all to give us your closing remarks. Please bear in mind that we are very tight on time. Shaylin, please go ahead.
Yes, now from a Marvin Count's perspective, I mean, we've always been about accountability and inclusiveness. I mean, just driving home the importance of voting. I mean, it's not just to have your voice heard, but just to be a part of this democratic process, which is a right, is a privilege. Even if you, just being involved in the process, just driving home the importance of that.
Collette?
Thank you so much. And I'm really pleased that this discussion revolved mostly around young people, because after all, I think, you know, without sounding glib, it really is the future of electoral politics in South Africa. And we need to find ways to bring young people back into the fray. So I think it's an important focus. I think for as long as young people are outside of formal representative politics, there's going to be a situation of mutual neglect and mutual sort of ignoring one another. Politicians will ignore the needs and the interests of young people because they know they don't vote, and young people will just continue to pull away from formal politics, and that needs to change, if only for the sort of the broader quality of the mandate we give our future governments in this country.
John?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I think part of dealing with a problem is admitting you've got a problem in the first place. I think we've all admitted there is a huge problem with young people that are opting out of the system. And I'm certainly very excited about some of the things that were discussed. And I think this needs to be an ongoing conversation that's had at every single sphere, whether it's civic society, schools, and by political parties themselves. We've got to get young people re-engaged in the system. rather than having them opt out. It is their future that is essentially being decided in the corridors of Parliament as we speak. And they've got a choice. You either let other people determine your future for you, or you get stuck and make sure you're part of the conversation. So I think there's a lot of challenges here as well, particularly for opposition parties, but also massive opportunity if we can get those voters activated and then out in numbers voting for change. I think it's a huge opportunity for opposition.
Thank you. And Chris?
Well, mine is less content related to my closing remarks, but I'd like to say thank you to Dr Collette, Shaylin, and Rebecca, of course, because I know that you've taken time out of very busy schedules with white line fever before the December holidays and, of course, the very busy things that are going on in Parliament. So thank you, and we really appreciate it. It's a big topic. For the participants, we will be sending out a recording of this video, which you can watch later. And, of course, we're going to be promoting it as well on our Twitter feed and on our Facebook feed. And you're very welcome and invited to watch it again there. And we're going to ask the DA as well to distribute it through their channels. After this, we close up here. I'm going to play one more video by Collette with closing remarks, and then our participants can leave. And I will play through the 4 videos that we've taken of Collette one more time for the participants if you would like to see them. And you can do that afterwards. But all the material will be available. And I urge you to read the full report by Collette, because it really gives us a benchmark of what we know about non-voters in South Africa. And it's the basis for the conversation that we need to have over the next couple of months as we go into the local government election. So thank you very much. And I look forward to seeing you at the next midpoint, where we speak about brittle democracies and the fading liberation parties in Africa.
Many South Africans indicate that they've pulled away from the polls because they lack what we call external political efficacy. This does not necessarily mean that they feel unable to understand or navigate the political system. Rather, they perceive the political system to be unresponsive to their needs. And this really goes to the heart of how we understand our democracy today, 25 years after democratization. For me, there are 2 messages which really come out of this research if we want to increase the number of people casting a vote in South African elections. Most importantly, political parties need to urgently and directly confront and address the growing discontent with conventional democratic politics amongst young people as a root cause of their disengagement with electoral politics. This goes to the heart of some of the reasons we found in the research for withdrawing from politics. Not only do we need to remind young people that there is a civic mindedness to elections, but we also need to show that the system is in fact responsive. Secondly, and equally as importantly, there's a growing number of South Africans who are interested in politics, follow politics, but remain disengaged at elections. And I attribute this to the fact that currently there are few parties that really present viable, credible alternatives. What really needs to happen from this perspective is that political parties themselves, and particularly opposition parties, need to reinvent themselves in South Africa, understand their electorate, move away from historical conversations and begin to have conversations that resonate with a young, mobilized electorate who are looking to the future. The purpose of the paper is to understand not as who is turning out to elections and voting, but who is not. In other words, what we really wanted to establish in this piece of research was understanding the demographic profile and attitudinal profiles of non-voters in South Africa. So why do research on non-voters in the first instance? In 2019, as we went to the polls in our general election, we saw a decrease, a sudden decrease in voter turnout and electoral participation. And this really accelerated an already steady decline in electoral participation since 1994. But the question is, so what? Does it matter if people begin to turn away from the polls? Well, low voter turnout globally is associated with negative indicators for the health of a democracy. It's seen perhaps as a sign of voter apathy. It's also seen as a sign of growing mistrust in the political system itself. It also throws question marks over the sanctioning and representative functions of a democracy. If people decline to turn out and participate, their views, thoughts, and preferences are not recorded in an election outcome, and this undermines representation. And then the overall quality of democracy, its entire legitimacy, can stand to be scrutinized. Of all eligible South Africans who are allowed to vote, 75% were registered. 66% of all registered citizens actually turned out to vote on the day. But if we take a step back and we look at the broader picture and we look at a far more accurate measure of voter turnout by looking at eligible voters, what we call the voting age population, all South Africans 18 years old and older who are eligible to cast a vote in South Africa, we find that in fact only 49% of all eligible South Africans cast a vote in 2019. This means that more South Africans did not vote. Although declining turnout in itself is a concern, the way it is unfolding in South Africa is of deep concern. And this is because it is being primarily driven by the withdrawal of young people from active voting. And this dramatic decrease in this particular age group is worrisome because South Africa has a young population, what we call a youth bulge. Now, although young people declining to participate is actually a global phenomenon, we see it in other democracies around the world, it's having a lesser impact on aggregate turnout because young people in older democracies make up a smaller proportion of the population. In South Africa, we make up a greater proportion of the population. So, in a sense, the inactivity of young people at elections will come to shape our future elections. And this is because voting is a learned habit. So what's actually happening is that the habit of not voting is being learned by young people in South Africa. And as they move up the age cohort, so this habit of non-voting is seeping into our electorate. Of course, non-voting has a lot to do with registration. So much of the research looks at who is registering and who is not registering. Of the under 40-year-olds who are eligible, only 46% are registered to vote. If we zoom in and look at the under 20s, so that'll be our 18, 19 and 20-year-olds, of all of those eligible to vote, only 19% are registered to do so, and fewer actually cast a vote. If we look at the under 30s, between 20 and 30-year-old, 54% are registered to vote. In other words, just over half can participate on the day. Political parties and independent candidates who wake up to the notion that we have a formidable force of young people who are up for grabs, potentially, and who push policy platforms and positions that resonate with this younger group of voters, they hold the key to future electoral swings in the country. Voters who are exposed to a greater variety of campaigns on the ground, in other words, they have a larger menu of political options in the urban provinces, are more likely to find a political home, be mobilized to vote through campaigning, and actually turn out at elections. This is in contrast to the rural provinces, where rural voters have begun to withdraw from voting in far greater proportions to urban voters. And we put this down to the possibility that these voters have less exposure to campaigns on the ground, and this is largely because opposition parties, the smaller parties, haven't got the resources and the ability to penetrate the rural provinces to the extent that they can in the bigger urban centres. And this leaves rural voters with a smaller choice from which to choose, and if they have become disillusioned with the ANC, they begin to withdraw their support, but they do not shift their support, and they become abstainers. Now, if we look at partisanship, party loyalties, we know that people with a strong party loyalty are more easily mobilized and tend to turn out to vote compared to non-partisans who are far harder to mobilize. And this decline in partisanship that we see in South Africa was quite pronounced in 2019. In other words, more South Africans than ever state that they do not feel close to a particular political party. And so they lack this psychological anchor in the political world that guides them on their voting choice and to participate at elections. So what this basically means is that this reliance using a traditional party queue is disappearing from the South African electorate. And it means that South African political parties and actors are going to have to work far harder to mobilize this growing group of voters to come to the polls. People tend to vote if they are encouraged to do so by the relationships that they have, their social networks, and the membership that they hold. So they are receiving political communication from their social networks, which encourage them and create a social desirability to turn out to vote. We know, for example, that somebody is far more likely to vote if their partner or spouse voted. They are far more likely to vote if they belong to a membership of a trade union or church or political party membership. And it's this sort of network that should be utilized in South Africa to encourage people to the polls. And I'm not suggesting that those networks push a partisan message, but one more of civic-mindedness, that voting is civic, it's a civic duty, it's a responsibility, and that it's an opportunity to actually formulate policy and change governments. But unfortunately, we also know that young people are less likely to be part of social and organizational networks. And this is one of the reasons why young people are traditionally quite difficult to mobilize to vote. They lack these social networks until later adulthood. We also know from the data that we ran for this paper that, in fact, if somebody feels discontented with government's overall performance, they are more likely to vote. Now, this was a very interesting finding because it suggests that, in fact, people look at elections as a sanctioning mechanism. They are using elections to reward or punish governments, incumbents, as they see fit. And this presents another strategy, another tactic for electoral players. We should be utilizing the discussions around government's performance and political party performance to mobilize people to come to the polls. If people are discontented, they need to understand that elections are there to lodge that dissatisfaction. But having said that, that's one part of the strategy. The other part of the strategy is to couple that with positive, progressive policy platforms and leadership quality, because that is the other half of the equation that is missing for voters. We can have discussions about whether we are content or discontented with government's performance and how that could be improved. But without presenting credible political alternatives, voters are still left bereft. They do not have alternative political homes to move their support to. And what we've seen in the data in South Africa for quite some time now is an increasing mistrust of the ANC. For example, in 2006, trust in the African National Congress-led government was at 62%. By 2018, Afrobarometer recorded that at 38%, quite a dramatic decline. Yet, a substantial proportion of South African voters do not perceive credible political alternatives elsewhere. And as a result of that, they are ultimately withdrawing from the electorate. They are not casting a vote. Voters who are exposed to a greater variety of campaigns on the ground, in other words, they have a larger menu of political options in the urban provinces, are more likely to find a political home, be mobilized to vote through campaigning, and actually turn out. Many South Africans indicate that they've pulled away from the polls because they lack what we call external political efficacy. This does not necessarily mean that they feel unable to understand or navigate the political system. Rather, they perceive the political system to be unresponsive to their needs. And this really goes to the heart of how we understand our democracy today, 25 years after democratization. For me, there are two messages which really come out of this research if we want to increase the number of people casting a vote in South African elections. Most importantly, political parties need to urgently and directly confront and address the growing discontent with conventional democratic politics amongst young people as a root cause of their disengagement with electoral politics. This goes to the heart of some of the reasons we found in the research for withdrawing from politics. Not only do we need to remind young people that there is a civic mindedness to elections, but we also need to show that the system is in fact responsive. Secondly, and equally as importantly, there's a growing number of South Africans who are interested in politics, follow politics, but remain disengaged at elections. And I attribute this to the fact that currently there are few parties that really present viable, credible alternatives. What really needs to happen from this perspective is that political parties themselves, and particularly opposition parties, need to reinvent themselves in South Africa, understand their electorate, move away from historical conversations and begin to have conversations that resonate with a young, mobilized electorate who are looking to the future.